The pilot's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Step away from the runway. Now!" An old man in a red jacket stood motionless beside a vintage P-51 Mustang, his weathered hand resting gently on the aircraft's silver fuselage. The pilot stormed closer, his face flushed with anger. "Sir, I said move! You can't just walk onto an active airfield and touch these planes!" The elderly man didn't flinch, didn't argue. He simply stood there, his sad eyes fixed on the aircraft, his white beard catching the early sunlight. The pilot reached for his radio. "Security, we have a situation at Hangar 7. Some old guy wandering around restricted areas." The man in the red jacket finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I flew this plane." The pilot's expression shifted from anger to exasperation. "Sure you did, buddy. Everyone who gets near these birds claims they're a veteran pilot. Now step back before I have you removed from the property." Richard Coleman had arrived at the airfield that morning before dawn, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. For 40 years he'd avoided air shows, museums, anything that reminded him of those days. But when he'd seen the advertisement for the vintage aircraft exhibition, when he'd seen that specific tail number in the photograph, something inside him had broken open. He'd driven 3 hours through the darkness, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. His wife had passed 2 years ago. His daughter lived across the country. The small apartment where he spent his days had become a prison of memories and silence. Nobody looked at him anymore, not really. He was just another old man shuffling through the world, invisible, irrelevant. The young people at the grocery store spoke to him slowly, loudly, as if age had made him simple. The clerk at the bank had once asked if he needed help reading the forms. He never corrected them, never mentioned what he'd done, who he'd been. What would be the point? The security guard arrived within minutes, a young man barely out of his 20s with an officious stride and a clipboard. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. You're trespassing in a restricted area." Richard turned slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just wanted to see her one more time." The guard's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "These aircraft are extremely valuable. We can't have unauthorized personnel touching them. There's a public viewing area where you can see the planes from behind the barriers." Richard nodded, beginning to turn away. His fingers lingered on the Mustang's metal skin for just a moment longer. The pilot crossed his arms. "You said you flew this plane?" Richard's voice was quiet. 85. Spring of 85, the pilot scoffed. "This aircraft has been in private collections and museums for decades. It hasn't been operational since the 90s. Richard's sad eyes met the pilot's. "Not this calendar year. 1945, April 19th specifically, over Berlin." The security guard paused, his hand halfway to his radio. The pilot's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into his features. Richard continued, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "She had a hydraulic issue with the left landing gear, made her pull hard to port on takeoff. You had to compensate constantly or she'd spin you into the ground. The engine ran hot too, always 10 degrees above spec on the temperature gauge, and there was a rivet right here that was slightly raised. You could feel it under your glove when you did your pre-flight check." He gestured to a spot on the fuselage. The pilot stepped closer, running his own hand over the metal. His face had gone pale. "There is a raised rivet there. I've felt it 100 times. Richard's voice grew distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere far away. "We called her Silver Ghost. She brought me home when 3 other planes in my squadron didn't make it back. She took flak over the Ruhr Valley that should have torn her apart, but she kept flying. The last mission I flew in her, we were escorting bombers deep into German territory. 2 Messerschmitts came at us from the sun. I put her into a dive that should have ripped the wings off, but she held together. She always held together." The security guard had lowered his radio completely now. The pilot's voice had lost all its earlier aggression. "Sir, what did you say your name was?" "Richard Coleman. Captain, back then. 473 combat hours, 52 missions." The pilot pulled out his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. After a moment he looked up, his eyes wide. "The owner of this aircraft, he keeps detailed records of its history. Every pilot who ever flew it. He's got a whole archive." Richard smiled sadly. "I know. I sent him some photographs once years ago. He wrote back a very kind letter. Said I should come see the plane sometime. I never did. Couldn't bring myself to, until today." The pilot was scrolling through something on his phone, his expression growing more shocked with each passing second. Captain Richard Coleman. Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 silver stars. You shot down 7 enemy aircraft. You were one of the youngest pilots in your squadron. Richard's voice was barely audible. 8 aircraft. The records always said 7, but there was one more. The last day of the war. Nobody counted it because the paperwork got lost in all the chaos of victory. The pilot's hand was shaking now. "Sir, I need to make a phone call. Please, please don't leave." The security guard had stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Captain, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Richard shook his head gently. "How could you? I'm just an old man in a worn jacket. You were doing your job." The pilot had his phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapidly. "Mr. Hartwell?" "Yes, I know it's early. Sir, you need to get down to the hangar immediately. Captain Richard Coleman is here." "Yes? That Richard Coleman? He's standing next to the Mustang right now." The pilot listened for a moment, then his eyes went even wider. "He's coming right now. He lives 20 minutes away." "Sir, Mr. Hartwell, he owns this plane and 6 others in the collection. He's been trying to find you for 15 years. Within 30 minutes, the hangar had transformed. Word had spread through the airfield like wildfire. Pilots, mechanics, volunteers, all gathering at a respectful distance. An elderly man in an expensive suit came rushing through the crowd, moving with surprising speed despite his age. His eyes were bright with tears. "Captain Coleman? I'm Thomas Hartwell. I've been hoping to meet you for so long." Richard extended his hand, but Hartwell pulled him into an embrace. "My father flew bombers in the war. He told me stories about the fighter escorts, about how you boys saved their lives again and again. When I bought this Mustang and started researching its history, your name kept appearing. You were a legend, Captain." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "I was just doing what we all did. Trying to survive, trying to bring our friends home." Hartwell stepped back, wiping his eyes. "The photographs you sent me, they're in my office. I've shown them to thousands of visitors over the years, but I could never track you down. You seem to have disappeared after the war." Richard looked at the Mustang, his reflection distorted in its polished surface. "I went home, got a job at a factory, got married, raised a daughter. I didn't talk about the war much. It felt like another life, another person. My wife, she knew some of it, but I never wanted to burden her with the details. All those boys who didn't come home, they deserved to be remembered more than I did." Hartwell shook his head firmly. "Captain, every one of you deserves to be remembered. Every single one." He turned to the crowd that had gathered. This man flew 52 combat missions before his 23rd birthday. He saved countless lives. He's a genuine American hero. The crowd began to applaud, the sound echoing through the hangar. Richard felt his eyes burning, his throat tight. The young pilot who had initially confronted him stepped forward, his face serious. "Captain Coleman, I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you. I should have shown respect." Richard placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You were protecting something valuable. That's honourable work. Don't apologise for doing your duty." Hartwell was already making plans, his voice animated with excitement. "Captain, we're hosting a major airshow next month. 50,000 people expected. I want you to be our guest of honour. I want you to tell your story. We'll restore your name to the side of this aircraft where it belongs. We'll make sure everyone knows what you did." Richard started to protest, but Hartwell held up a hand. "Please, let us honour you the way you should have been honoured decades ago. Let these young people see what real courage looks like. Let them understand the price that was paid for their freedom." Richard looked around at the faces surrounding him. The security guard who had tried to remove him, the pilot who had yelled at him, the mechanics and volunteers, many of them young enough to be his grandchildren. They were all watching him with expressions of respect, admiration, even awe. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. The young pilot spoke again, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. "Captain, what was it like? Flying combat missions in a plane like this?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the Mustang's wing. It was terrifying, every single time. You'd climb into the cockpit knowing that some of you wouldn't be coming back. You'd look at your wingman and wonder if this was the last time you'd see his face. The fear never went away. You just learned to fly with it, to use it to keep yourself sharp. But there was something else too, a sense of purpose. We knew what we were fighting for. We knew why it mattered, and we had each other. That bond, that brotherhood, it's something I've never found anywhere else in my life. The hangar had gone completely silent. Even the distant sounds of the airfield seemed to have faded away. Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. This plane, she was more than just metal and rivets to us. She was a partner, a protector. You trusted her with your life, and she trusted you to bring her home. Every scratch, every dent, every repair, they all told a story. And when you landed after a mission, when you climbed out and put your hand on her fuselage, you were thanking her for keeping you alive one more day. Hartwell had tears streaming down his face now. Captain, I've owned this aircraft for 12 years. I've flown her hundreds of hours, but I never truly understood her until this moment. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his sad features. She's a good plane. Treat her well. The young pilot stepped forward again. Sir, would you, if you're comfortable with it, would you sit in the cockpit? Just for a moment? Richard's eyes widened. I don't know if I can still climb up there. My knees aren't what they used to be. Immediately 3 young men rushed forward with a ladder. Hartwell positioned it carefully beside the Mustang. Captain, we'll help you. Take your time. Richard approached the ladder slowly, his heart pounding. It had been 40 years since he had sat in a cockpit. 40 years since he'd felt that particular mixture of fear and exhilaration. With assistance from the young men, he climbed carefully up the ladder and lowered himself into the pilot's seat. The moment he settled into the cockpit, something shifted inside him. The years fell away. His hands found the controls instinctively, his feet resting on the rudder pedals. Everything was exactly where it should be. The instrument panel, though restored and modernized in places, still held the essential geography of his memory. He could almost smell the oil and fuel, almost hear the engine's roar. His fingers traced the throttle, the stick. Muscle memory from decades ago flowing back through his body. Below him, the crowd watched in reverent silence. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, and he was 22 again. The sky was full of fighters and bombers. The radio crackled with urgent voices. His wingman was off his right side, maintaining formation, and ahead, through the clouds, the target, the mission, the reason they were all there, risking everything. When Richard opened his eyes, they were wet with tears. He looked down at Hartwell, at the young pilot, at all the faces turned upward toward him. These people, they had no idea what it had cost. How many boys had died in planes just like this one? How many families had received telegrams that shattered their worlds? How many futures had been erased in seconds of violence and fire? But they were here now, preserving these aircraft, honouring the memory of those times. That meant something. That mattered. Richard carefully climbed back down the ladder, accepting help from the young men who steadied him. When his feet touched the ground, Hartwell embraced him again. Thank you, Captain. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being here today. Richard's voice was thick with emotion. Thank you for taking care of her, for keeping her flying, for making sure people remember. The young pilot who had initially confronted Richard stepped forward one more time. Captain Coleman, I was wrong about more than just who you were. I was wrong about what these planes represent. I thought they were just machines, just valuable artifacts to be protected and preserved. But they're not. They're monuments. They're memories. They're the physical embodiment of courage and sacrifice. And I promise you, sir, I will never forget that again. Richard nodded, placing his hand one final time on the Mustang's fuselage. The metal was warm under his palm, heated by the morning sun. She's in good hands. I can see that now. Hartwell walked Richard slowly toward the hangar entrance, the crowd parting respectfully. Before you go, Captain, please, let me get your contact information. Let me send you details about the airshow. Let me make sure you're properly honoured. Richard paused, looking back at the Mustang one last time. The silver paint gleamed. The propeller stood still and silent. But in his mind, he could hear the engine roaring, could feel the stick responding to his touch, could see the endless sky opening up before him. Over the following weeks, Richard's life changed in ways he never could have anticipated. Hartwell was true to his word. The airshow became a celebration not just of vintage aircraft, but of the men who had flown them. Richard's photograph, young and serious in his flight suit, was displayed on banners throughout the event. His story was told and retold. School children listened with wide eyes as he described what it was like to fly into combat. Veterans from later wars shook his hand, thanking him for paving the way. And the Mustang, his Mustang, flew again with his name painted on the fuselage just below the canopy, Captain Richard Coleman. He stood on the flight line as the plane roared past, and for a moment, just a moment, he was young again. The pilot who had yelled at him that first morning became one of his closest friends. They spent hours together, Richard sharing stories and wisdom, the young pilot listening with genuine reverence. The security guard who had tried to remove him volunteered to drive Richard to veteran events, refusing to accept payment, saying it was an honour. And Richard, who had spent so many years invisible and forgotten, found himself surrounded by people who saw him, truly saw him, for who he was and what he had done. He learned that respect wasn't something you demanded, or even something you earned through past deeds alone. It was something freely given when people understood the depth of sacrifice and service. The old man in the red jacket was no longer just an old man. He was a link to history, a living reminder of courage, a symbol of everything that generation had endured and overcome. And the Mustang, that beautiful silver ghost, continued to fly, carrying with it the memory of all those who had trusted their lives to her wings, and the legacy of the young men who had become old men, and the old men who had never stopped being heroes.